Good morning, pilots, and welcome to War Thunder Bootcamp, the series dedicated to helping you get better at War Thunder. In today's episode, we'll be taking a look at aircraft radar. Radar is one of the most confusing aspects of War Thunder, especially if you're new to top-tier air battles. In this video though, I'll break down every radar system in the game, and explain how they work, what keybinds you should use, and more. On most high-ranking jets, you'll find two radar interfaces. On the left, we have RWR, or the Radar Warning Receiver, which is a topic for a future episode. On the right, we have the Search and Tracking Radar, which is the main focus for today. This can either be a cone or a rectangle, depending on this option in the settings. The cone layout clumps nearby targets together, but it's a matter of preference, so try them both out and see which one you like best. I'll be using the rectangle layout in this video. The Search Radar UI has a bunch of information. Let's start with the most basic ones. The y-axis represents distance from your aircraft. The higher the target, the further away it is from you. You can see the current maximum distance on the top right. If a target is beyond this value, your radar won't pick it up. If the range has an asterisk next to it, that means you can toggle it with the Change Radar Scope Scale keybind. If you're playing realistic, somewhere between 35 and 60 kilometers is usually enough. The x-axis represents the azimuth, which is left or right. At the top of the UI on either side, you'll find two azimuth angles, which are the horizontal limits of your radar's gimbal. Your aircraft's current azimuth is always in the center line. On some aircraft, the gimbal limit can be wider than the search zone. If that's the case, you can hover over your radar and hold right-click to move your current search zone. On the left, you'll see a couple of angle measurements and small horizontal lines. These represent the radar's elevation coverage. The top and bottom are the vertical limits of your radar's gimbal. The box with the moving line is your current scope, which is fixed to the center unless you manually move it. I'll talk about these in more detail in the keybinds section. On the top left, you'll see the search zone of the radar, represented by the horizontal and vertical degrees. These are indicated by the moving green lines in third person. If a target is outside this range, it won't get picked up. Once again, if you see an asterisk, that means you can change the zone by using the Change Radar Search Mode keybind. Generally, if you're searching for targets, you want the zone to be as wide as possible. When you're trying to get a lock, it's a good idea to shrink it as much as you can, so that your radar knows what to lock onto. The smaller the zone, the more frequently you'll get updates on enemy positions. If you want to see all the various radar controls, click on the Change Radar Control Mode button in the action bar. By the way, almost all the radar keybinds say radar/IRST. We'll get to IRST later on in the video, but for now, you can just ignore it. On top of the radar interface, you'll see some acronyms. This is your radar mode. It can seem pretty intimidating at first, but it's actually quite simple. You can divide them into two groups, operating mode and processing mode. Let's go over the operating modes first. SRC, or Search Mode, is the most common one you'll find. It's quite basic. It constantly scans the area it's set to, detects targets, and updates their positions. When it does so, you'll see a couple of small rectangles showing up. These represent the targets that your radar detects. On higher-end radar models, you'll see different symbols like jets, munitions, helicopters, etc. If there are multiple targets inside an area, you can hover over the radar and zoom in to take a closer look. Keep in mind that each time your radar updates an enemy's position, they'll get a ping on their RWR. If your radar has IFF, or Identification Friend or Foe, you'll see an extra rectangle above a friendly contact. If your radar has this feature, you can use the Next IFF Radar Filter keybind to filter out friendlies from being detected and tracked. SRC mode doesn't do anything besides detection. If you want to lock onto a target, you'll need BVR, or Beyond Visual Range. With this feature, your radar will automatically select the target, represented by two vertical lines. You can switch between selected targets with the Select Radar Target to Lock keybind. This doesn't track the target though. To do that, you have to press the Lock Radar on Target keybind. Once you've pressed this key, you'll enter either ACM, which I'll explain later, or ACQ, Acquisition Mode. You can only enter ACQ mode if you have at least one contact on your radar. Once you're in Acquisition mode, your radar will start searching for targets to lock onto. When the target is found, the radar will attempt to lock onto it. Keep in mind that on some older radar models, your acquisition zone can be a lot smaller than your search zone, indicated by a darker area on the UI, which means that you can only lock onto targets inside that area. Once you're in ACQ and you line up the target, your radar will switch to TRK or tracking mode. This means that you've locked onto a target and you'll be able to see their distance, relative velocity, and trajectory. If the trajectory line is pointed down, that means the enemy is flying towards you and vice versa. If there are multiple targets inside your acquisition area, you can use the Select Radar Target to Lock keybind to lock onto the target you want. You have to do this before switching to ACQ mode though. Once you've entered TRK mode, you can then spool and launch radar-guided missiles and slave infrared missiles to the selected target. If your plane has EEGS or Enhanced Envelope gun sights, you'll also see a guided crosshair when you get close enough to the target. To unlock a target, simply press the same keybind you used for locking. Your lock will be broken if the target moves outside your radar area. If your lock breaks by itself, you'll enter TRK MEM or Track Memory mode, indicated by a flashing square. In this mode, your radar tries to predict where the target is and tries to relock if possible. SAR missiles will follow this prediction until the lock fully breaks. So that's the most basic combination: search, acquisition, and track. Like I mentioned though, there can also be another mode in between, namely ACM or Air Combat Maneuvering mode. This mode has a major advantage over ACQ. You can enable it whenever you want, regardless of whether you've detected the enemy or not. Once it's enabled, it'll lock onto the first target it can, so you don't have to manually lock them yourself. This can be extremely useful in dogfights. The keybind is usually radar beyond within visual range combat, but some older aircraft like the MiG-19 have ACM instead of ACQ, so the button is the same as the radar lock keybind in that case. Some of the more modern aircrafts also have HMS or Helmet Mounted Sight mode. ACM mode requires you to turn your plane towards the target to get a lock. HMS on the other hand lets you use your third-person camera instead, allowing you to lock onto targets with ease. Keep in mind that this mode doesn't lock on automatically, so once you hover over the target, make sure to press the Lock on Target keybind to actually track them. While it requires a bit more multitasking, it's a vital feature for top-tier jousting. To use it, press the Beyond Within Visual Range Combat keybind twice, so it goes SRC, ACM, HMS, and then back to SRC. HMS can also be called HMD or Helmet Mounted Display. The two modes are the exact same. Last but not least, we have TWS or Track While Scan mode. TWS performs similarly to SRC but with one key difference: it can automatically track targets and still keep searching. The lock is different from what you'd get with all the previous modes. Instead of a hard lock which triggers radar warnings, TWS gives you a soft lock, indicated by a disconnected square. The maximum number of contacts on your TWS is shown in the stat card of your radar. The main purpose of TWS is to launch active radar homing missiles, and you can switch between targets with the Select Target to Lock keybind. As long as the target stays within your TWS range, missiles with data links will continue to receive updates from your radar. You can't launch SAR missiles with a soft lock though, so make sure to hard lock a target with the Lock on Target key if needed. If your plane doesn't carry active radar homing missiles, TWS can still be useful to spot enemies, since the soft locks give you a visual target in third person. However, the soft locks are less reliable, more prone to chaffing, and are pretty much useless up close, so make sure to switch to a regular hard lock when you're ready to engage. Okay, so those were all the operating modes. Here's a quick recap. You use search to find enemies, switch to acquisition to start tracking, and once you're in track, you can launch radar-guided missiles. Some aircraft have access to Air Combat Maneuver mode, which lets you skip the acquisition mode and start tracking immediately after lining the target up. Helmet-mounted display lets you look at a target in third person and lock them without moving your plane. Track while scan lets you soft lock targets and launch active radar homing missiles, and instantly switch to track mode if you want a hard lock. Now we'll move on to processing modes. These are the various ways your radar system uses data to find targets. First up is pulse, most commonly found on older radar types. If your operating mode doesn't have another acronym beside it, there's a big chance your processing mode is gonna be pulse. This is the most basic way of processing. The radar sends out a pulse of energy, listens for echoes, and determines the distance by how long it took for the energy to return. This method is rather primitive and has two main drawbacks. The first is ground clutter. Radar waves bounce off of every surface, including the ground. If your target is flying lower than you, they become pretty much invisible to your radar. You can see ground clutter on your radar by the lighter area on the UI, or the stacked horizontal lines next to the acronyms. The second drawback is countermeasures. If your enemy deploys chaff, your pulse radar will almost always unlock the enemy and lock onto said chaff. If the enemy isn't completely deaf, they'll start popping countermeasures when they get a lock warning on their RWR, so it's a good idea to wait until you're ready to launch your missile. The second processing mode is PD, or Pulse Doppler, found on more modern aircraft. Instead of relying solely on distance, PD radars analyze the frequency shift in the returning signal to calculate the enemy's velocity as well. This phenomenon is called the Doppler effect, hence the name Pulse Doppler. Since chaff is much slower than an enemy plane and the ground is standing still, Pulse Doppler radars can filter these out and focus on the actual target. That being said, PD can be countered by a method known as notching, which is when the target flies perpendicular to your radar. From your radar's point of view, a plane flying at 90 degrees has pretty much no velocity, and if the enemy deploys chaff, it might lock onto that instead. Going one step further, there's also PDV, or Pulse Doppler Velocity mode. Regular Pulse Doppler relies on distance as the main source of information, using speed as a secondary source. PDV mode, on the other hand, prioritizes velocity instead, aggressively filtering anything close to a relative speed of 0. Notice how I said relative speed. If the target is flying close to the same velocity as you, they won't get picked up. Not only that, but the interface is also different than usual. The higher the contact, the faster they're approaching you, and vice versa. The values on the top and bottom represent the maximum and minimum speed that your radar can detect. On some aircraft, the minimum value can be negative, in which case you'll also get a dead zone. Your dead zone will be larger the faster you're going, and if a contact is below your dead zone, that means they're flying away from you. While it is useful against ground clutter and chaff, regular Pulse Doppler is usually much more reliable and simple to understand. Another processing mode you'll often see on high-ranking jets is HDN, which stands for head-on. This is where it gets a bit confusing, but bear with me. Pulse Doppler radars have two different modes, medium and high pulse repetition frequency, MPRF and HPRF respectively. As you might have guessed from their names, their main difference is the frequency of their radar beams. If you don't have HDN enabled, your Pulse Doppler radar will be in MPRF mode, also called all aspect, which balances range and velocity when detecting. When you switch to head-on mode, your radar will switch to HPRF, which prioritizes velocity instead. This means that in HDN mode, your radar will perform better at longer ranges, especially when the enemy is flying towards you. If they're up close or they're running away though, regular Pulse Doppler is the better choice. Keep in mind that some radars with HDN can also have a dead zone, so it won't be able to detect targets if they're too close to you. You can switch to HDN mode at the start of a match, then switch back to Pulse Doppler when the dogfights start happening. The next processing mode is MTI, or Moving Target Indicator. It's basically an earlier and worse version of Pulse Doppler, which can be found on some Cold War jets. In real life, MTI and PD process pulses differently, but all you need to know is that in-game they do pretty much the same thing, which is reducing ground clutter. On some aircraft like the MiG-23, this mode will be enabled automatically if you go below a certain altitude and look towards the ground. On other aircraft like some of the Mirages though, you'll have to switch into it. Okay, those were the most common processing modes. I know that was a lot to take in, but let's just recap. World War II and early Cold War aircraft will almost always be in pulse mode, which doesn't have an acronym. More advanced jets can either have Pulse Doppler or Moving Target Indicator modes. These two help reduce ground clutter and are more resistant to chaff. Pulse Doppler Velocity mode prioritizes speed instead of distance, which has its ups and downs, but regular Pulse Doppler is better in most cases. Head-on mode also prioritizes velocity, but acts more like regular Pulse Doppler. It performs better when enemies are flying towards you, but worse when they're flying away from you. Like I mentioned in the intro, there's another sensor system besides radars, and that's IRST, or Infrared Search and Track. This is not a radar mode, rather it's a whole separate system. Instead of sending radio waves and listening to their reflections, IRST detects targets using heat signatures, the same as infrared missiles. The positives are that IRST doesn't trigger radar warnings, it's not affected by ground clutter, and is immune to chaff. As for negatives, IRST can't be used to fire radar radar-guided missiles. It can be fooled by flares, and it doesn't provide range or speed information unless it's a more recent model. All in all, it can be useful to slave infrared missiles or to enable ballistic computers without your target realizing it, but besides that, radar is usually more effective. IRST mode can be enabled and disabled by pressing the switch between radar and IRST keybind, and you'll know it's enabled if you see the IR acronym next to your operating mode. Now we'll move on to some of the more obscure models and modes. If you're not interested, you can skip to this timestamp to learn about keybinds. First, let's take a look at radars from World War II. A big number of them tend to be simple versions of the ones I mentioned, like basic search radars, some of them with ACM and TRK modes. Obviously, you won't be launching any guided missiles at this rank, so they're mostly used for detection, handy if you're playing Sim or Ground RB. An even more primitive radar type can be found on German interceptors like the Dornier 217s. You might have noticed these sticks hanging out from the nose of these planes. These are dipole antennas, and they're used to transmit and receive radar pulses. Instead of a scanning beam that combs through an area, these radars have a fixed zone with a larger beam. This has the benefit of updating target information almost instantly, but the drawbacks are major. It's extremely vulnerable to ground clutter, which often takes up half the scan area. To make it somewhat usable, both you and the enemy have to be at a high altitude, otherwise the dead zone will simply be too large. Not only that, but because it uses such a low frequency, the contacts it picks up are very wide on the radar. All in all, not very useful in-game. Next, we have radar rangefinders, also called radar gunsights. These appear as a single column of radar stuck in ACQ mode, which switches to TRK mode automatically when it finds a target. You can't launch SAR missiles with these, and they don't even slave infrared missiles anymore. It's pretty much only useful for simulator. Next, we'll be looking at C-scopes. Instead of a separate mode, these are just different views of your existing radars. If your model has this feature, you'll see an extra interface below your regular display. These provide a vertical view of your radar, so instead of being top-down, it's forward-facing. Rather than showing how far away a target is, it gives you their elevation. By the way, the cone view's official name is PPI, or Plan Position Indicator, while the rectangular view is called a B-scope. Now we'll move on to niche radar modes, starting with GMTI or Ground Moving Target Indicator, previously known as GTM or Ground Targeting Mode. As the name suggests, this mode is basically MTI but for close air support. It lets you detect and lock on to moving ground and naval vehicles. Keyword being moving though, if the target is stationary, they won't show up on your radar. Similarly, we also have AG, or air-to-ground radar. Unlike GMTI, this mode detects stationary targets as well as moving ones. However, it does not let you lock onto any targets, so it's just for detection. Next is C mode. As you might have guessed, this mode is designed solely for detection of naval targets. Unlike GMTI, the ship doesn't have to be moving for you to lock onto it, and once you do, you can launch guided munitions like the anti-ship missiles on the German Tornado. Next up is RAM, or Rate Assessment Mode. You can think of it as TWS focused on a smaller area. It can be useful for switching between a couple of targets that are flying close to each other. To activate it, get a hard lock on a target first, then press your Change Radar Mode button. Finally, let's talk about the most advanced radar system, AESA, or Active Electronically-Scanned Array. Unlike all the previous radars, which physically move an antenna left and right, AESA radars use hundreds or thousands of tiny transmitters and receivers that steer the radar beam electronically. This means much faster updates, stronger multi-target tracking, and much better resistance to chaff compared to traditional models. At the time of recording, AESA hasn't been implemented yet, but Gaijin said they do so once every nation got a plane that carries it. For now, you can expect a much faster and stronger version of top-tier radar models. Alright, those were all the systems and modes. Let's take a look at keybinds next. Here's a list of all my settings. We'll go over them one by one and explain what they do. I use a QWERTY keyboard layout and a mouse with two side buttons, named mouse button 4 and 5 respectively. Your setup might be different, so your mileage may vary. Select radar target to lock switches between detected targets on your radar and allows you to lock them when you press the Lock Radar on Target key. This also switches your soft locks in TWS mode. you're gonna want to set these somewhere easy to reach. I have the select target key set to / and the lock on target set to mouse button 5. If you're still far away from the combat, you can also select and lock onto targets by clicking and double clicking on a target. Horizontal and vertical radar target queue control axes are a bit more complicated. If you disable cyclic target switching of aircraft's radar in the options, you can manually control your target queue. I highly recommend keeping the option enabled though, since radar is confusing enough as it is. Radar tilt control axis increases and decreases the vertical angle that your radar searches in. You can see where the radar is searching by looking at the left side of your radar UI. Like I explained previously, the lines at the top and bottom are the limits, and the moving box is your current search zone. This can be a useful keybind if you're trying to lock onto a target that's above or below your radar without having to move your plane. To reset the zone, you can press the Reset Radar Direction to Bore Side keybind. If you have the View Zone Follows the Selected Target when Cyclic Switching is used option, your radar can go off-center if the target moves outside its limits. To reset the zone, simply press the same reset keybind. Switch radar on-off is pretty self-explanatory. It turns your radar on and off. Make sure to enable the automatic activation of aircraft radar at mission start option. Otherwise, you'll have to turn your radar on at the start of each match. Switch between radar and IRST is also what you'd expect. It switches between your normal radar and infrared search and track. Most planes don't have IRST, but if you do use it, the keybind should be somewhere not too far away. Change radar mode lets you switch between the various operating modes that your radar has, like search, TWS, HDN, and so on. You can set the mode you want before a match starts as well. Radar Beyond Within Visual Range Combat lets you switch between your radar's processing modes. In order, they are Search, ACM, and HMS mode. These two are crucial, make sure you can reach them easily. I have the Change Mode keybind set to 4, and Switch Beyond Within Visual Range Combat set to mouse button 4. By the way, there's currently a bug where if you're in ACM mode and you try to manually lock someone, the radar turns off for some reason. To turn it back on, just press the same keybind. Change Radar Search Mode lets you increase or decrease the search zone of your radar. When you're searching for targets, keep this as large as possible. If you're trying to lock onto a specific one, shrink it as much as you can. While not every radar has this feature, it's still a good idea to keep the button close by. Switch Radar Elevation Stabilization on-off is more complex. If you turn it on, your radar search zone will stay at the same elevation regardless of where your nose is pointed. You can see the current center of your search zone with the longer horizontal line. If you disable the Disable Radar Antenna Elevation Stabilization at Mission Start option, it'll do this automatically when you spawn in. This is a very situational keybind. I've personally never used it, but if you want to have full control of your radar, you can go ahead. To reset the elevation back to the center, press the Reset Radar Direction to Bore Side keybind. Change Radar Scope Scale increases the range that your radar searches in. This can be useful at the start of a match when everyone's far away, or when you're looking for that last enemy that's hiding around somewhere. I use the 9 key on my numpad for this since it's not exactly a crucial keybind. Next, IFF Radar Filter lets you switch between the various IFF settings on your radar. To be honest, there's no real point to setting a keybind for this. I usually just have my IFF set to enemies only, but it could be useful in simulator mode. Likewise, we also have Next Target Type Filter. If your radar can differentiate between jets, munitions, and helicopters, this keybind will only display the selected type and filter out the rest. This can also be done by clicking on the options on the right of the radar. To disable or enable these filters, you can use the Enable Disable Target Type Filter keybind. Now time for a gameplay example. At the start of a match, I switched to TWS HDN mode and increased my radar's range to the max. This gives me an overview of all the targets in the battle. After I climb for a bit and get closer, I switch back to 50 kilometers. You can switch between targets by either using the keybind or simply click on them on the radar UI. I see a target get close enough to me, so I hard lock him and fire a SAR missile. Make sure to keep the target locked, otherwise this type of missile won't know where to go. If your target manages to break your lock, you can simply lock them again and the missile will continue following them. Once the battle really gets going, I switch to my search PD mode for better close range performance. Another target found, I lock on and fire my missile. Radar slaving is a good way to avoid team kills and make sure the missile goes where you want it to. If you're in a dogfight, switching to HMD is a good idea. Another example in my MiG-23 this time. Since this plane is more limited in its radar choices, I have to be a bit more resourceful. The match starts and I set my radar to its maximum range limit. Once I get close, I reduce the range and look for targets. I find one, lock them, and fire a SAR missile. After using all my radar guided missiles, I switch to IRST mode so the enemy doesn't get an RWR warning. Lock a target for radar slaving and fire the missile. And that about wraps it up. That was a lot of knowledge to take in, so if you didn't absorb all of it at first, rewatch some of the segments and experiment by yourself in the game. The keybinds can be hard to remember at first, but after enough practice, they'll become second nature to you. You can only learn so much from a video, so make sure to practice, get that muscle memory going, and come back to this guide whenever you need to. Now get out there and find some targets. Dismissed.